been reflecting in this series on stepping stones, those opportunities that we have to grow closer in grace to our Lord. Because there are those special moments in our lives where the clouds part and the sunlight shines down upon us, and we see more clearly the path that we're walking. Last spring, I had the opportunity literally to take those stepping stones, walking in the ancient pathway of the Camino. Camino is the Spanish word for the way. It's the most famous footpath for pilgrims in the world, and each year thousands of pilgrims descend on Spain to walk this ancient pathway. That's what I had the opportunity to do for a little over 2 weeks. Now, if you walk the whole Camino, it's almost 500 miles. It begins in France at Saint-Jean, and then it ends at St. James Compostela, or Santiago, Spanish for St. James. The tradition is that that's the final resting place for the apostle. Now, St. James, this is the tradition, came to Spain and evangelized those people. But when the persecution broke out in the Holy Land, he went back to Israel, and there he was martyred by King Herod, who beheaded him, the first of the faithful apostles to die for Christ. But his disciples carried his body back to Spain and buried it there, where it was honored, but eventually the burial site was lost. And then through a miraculous event, it was rediscovered and a church was built over it, and pilgrims began coming to that site. To this day, St. James is honored as one of the patron saints of Spain. Now, pilgrimages are not distinct to Christianity. All the great religions of the world have pilgrimages. But the power of a pilgrimage is that you go to a holy site, and along the way you're experiencing some deprivation, some hardship, and you're doing that for the sake of some spiritual renewal. Most of the popular Christian pilgrimages these days are bus pilgrimages. You get in a comfortable air-conditioned bus, and then you drive to these holy sites, and then you feast. There isn't a whole lot of fasting that's involved in that, and not too much hardship as you stay in really nice hotels. The Camino is different than that. There are various levels of doing the Camino. If you walk it really tough way, you're carrying all of the stuff that you have in your backpack, and you're walking the entire almost 500 miles for 30 to 35 days across a wide variety of terrain. And you're staying in these albergues with many other pilgrims, which are largely like big dorms. Well, our pilgrim group, we did Camino light. So we didn't walk the entire distance. We walked about 150 miles of it, which was plenty, and we walked for 14 to 16 miles a day. And we, truth be told, we didn't stay in the albergues. We did stay in hotels along the way. Our pilgrim group varied. The youngest was a young man who was just 12 years old, and then the oldest was a gentleman who actually turned 80 years old on the pilgrimage. We had some people that were in fantastic shape on the pilgrimage. They were marathon runners. One of them regularly ran super marathons. And then there were some people that were a bit overweight and not in such good health. So each person participated to the extent that they could, and if they reached the end of their limit, then they would call a taxi cab to finish off the rest of the walk for the day. What I stressed over and over again was it wasn't a contest, it was a pilgrimage. And each person would be tested to the extent of their ability in walking the pilgrimage. And the trip was not so much about physical endurance as it was about spiritual renewal. Now, as you're walking along the Camino pathway, there are these arrows that point your way to Santiago, to the Basilica of St. James. And a couple hundred years ago, a famous priest by the name of Father Elias started to revive the Camino way, and he painted these yellow arrows, sometimes in the pavement, sometimes on the bricks, sometimes on the trees along the way. And so as you're walking the Camino, you are constantly looking for these arrows. And as you get closer and closer to Santiago, the arrows become more visible and fancier. In fact, as you reach the province of Galicia, they're on stone pedestals. And people often carry stones, they're called burden stones, along the way, reminders of people that you want to pray for or hardships that you've experienced along the way that you want to surrender. And so one of the traditions is when you come to these little markers, you'll take one of your burden stones and you'll place it by the marker. Well, one of the pilgrims in our group, her name was Peggy, and she's given me permission to tell this story, so I'm not breaking any confidence. Peggy had some earphones and she was listening to some praise and worship music as she's walking along the Camino. So she's walking along and she's praising the Lord, listening to this music and enjoying the beautiful sky. And we walked in the spring, and so there were flowers that were budding. It was chilly, and so we had to keep our hats and gloves on. But she's walking along and she comes to one of these markers, and she takes out of her backpack one of these burden stones and she places it on the marker. Now, these arrows didn't just point the way, they also became symbols of the Camino. The arrows were the first of 5 symbols on the Camino that I want to tell you about. Now, one of our pilgrims, her name was Peggy, was walking along and she had her earphones on and she was praising the Lord. And as she walked along, she was noticing the beauty of the countryside, the sun breaking through the clouds, and she was just enjoying herself. And she came to one of those yellow markers on a stone, and she took out one of her burden stones and she put it on the marker. And that was especially significant for her. And so she said, I want to remember this. So she reached in and she took out her camera and she took a picture of that mile marker and that yellow arrow to remind her of the event. Now, the arrow was pointing in this direction, and so she took the picture and she put her camera away, and then she promptly walked in the opposite direction of where the arrow was pointing. That became an important story for us in the pilgrimage, because so often the Lord gives us arrows. He points us in the right direction, and we look at them and then we go in the opposite direction. We read in the Holy Bible what God tells us to do, and then we promptly ignore it. We hear sermons at church, or we enter into the quiet of our prayer and we get a sense of direction of what we need to do, and then we get distracted somehow and we go in the wrong direction. So the first of those 5 symbols are we have to look for the arrows in our life that are pointing us in the direction of our ultimate goal, which is heaven, and we have to follow where those arrows are leading. Now, the second of those 5 symbols is a first aid kit. It's impossible to go through the Camino without being filled with aches and pains and hurts, because you're being pushed to your physical limit. You do the whole Camino, 30 to 35 days, but even the 15 days that we were on pilgrimage was very taxing, walking 13, 14, 15 miles a day. Now, the most common thing that happens to folks is they develop blisters on their feet. Matter of fact, about 2/3 of the people on our pilgrimage got blisters. Some of them were so severe that people had to take a break for 1 or 2, in some cases 3 days, to be able to allow their feet to heal. But more equally common would be hurting your back or straining a muscle. Sometimes people would get dizzy. Now, we were fortunate that we had several doctors along the pilgrimage with us, and we had a couple of nurses as well. But life is filled with hurt. None of us are going to get through our life pain-free. There's always going to be aches, there's always going to be pain, and like I say, none of us are going to get out of this life alive. eventually something is going to get us. And so as we're walking along the pilgrim path with our aches and our pains, we have to be honest about what we can do and what we can't do. So it is in life. We need to take care of our bodies. We need to recognize our limits, but we also need to stretch. We need to push ourselves and be honest about what we can do and what we can't do. And we need to ask for help when we need help. One of the struggles in the pilgrimage was with my sister Trish. Trish came down with a strep throat just days before we were set to go to Spain. She was afraid that she wasn't going to be able to go on the pilgrimage. And in fact, the day before the pilgrimage, she was so sick, she couldn't even get out of bed. But she went to one of the doctors, and the doctor gave her some medicine, and he said, "I think you'll be okay if you take it easy." We flew over to Spain, and she started feeling better. And it's the first day of the pilgrimage. And I looked at Trish, and she was pale as a ghost, and I knew there was no way that she was going to be able to walk. But she had come all this way, and she wanted to walk the pilgrimage. And she said, "Okay, I think I'm ready to go." And we're going to walk 12 miles that day. And I said, "Trish, I don't think you should do that." She said, "No, I want to do that." And she said, "Let me just sit down and think about whether I can do this." And I said, "Trish, your pilgrimage has already begun. What you need to do is embrace the fact that your body needs time to heal. And everybody else is going to be walking, and you're going to be behind, and I know that's humiliating and that's hard, but you can set an example for the rest of the pilgrims by acknowledging what you can do and what you can't do." Trish was humble enough to accept that logic, and so she had to wait out the first 2.5 days of the pilgrimage. But then her body got the strength, and she was able to do what she could do for the rest of the pilgrimage. Symbol number 2 in the pilgrimage is acknowledging there are going to be aches and pains. Do what you can do and leave the rest in God's hands. Symbol number 3, the backpack. Now, as I mentioned, we were doing Camino light. For those sturdy, hardy pilgrims, they would pack everything that they needed for their 30 or 35-day trek in their backpack. But for us, because we were just traveling from one hotel to the other, this was just basically a day pack. So we'd carry a little bit of food and a change of clothes, because we'd start out in the morning and it would be quite chilly, and then as the day went on, it would get warmer and warmer, and we would be able to shed some of those clothes, and we'd have to still be able to take our water and some of the extra supplies. But we didn't actually need a whole lot. But the mistake that so many of us pilgrims made is we carried far too many things. And I looked around at some of our other pilgrims, and they had huge backpacks that were stuffed with all kinds of stuff. There was one of our pilgrims whose backpack was very, very heavy. And this pilgrim was walking along, and we were really struggling. And I said, "Well, let me help you with that." And I picked up that backpack, and boy, it weighed a ton. And I said, "What do you got in there?" And the pilgrim said, "Well, I couldn't fit everything in my suitcase, so I just decided whatever I couldn't fit in the suitcase, I would carry along." Now, I could look at that and said, "You don't need all of those things." But then I started thinking about the stuff that I was carrying. I was carrying 2 first aid kits. Now, I didn't need to carry 2 first aid kits because there were several doctors and nurses along the way, but as the priest leader of the group, I felt overly responsible, and I felt I needed to do that. And we looked at the weather report, and there was no chance that it was going to rain, but I couldn't trust the weather report, so just in case, I had to take an extra poncho and some rain gear along the trip. And every 3 miles or 4 miles or so, there was a little stand where we could buy some food and get some extra water, so we didn't need to carry a lot of that stuff, but I had a hard time trusting in that. Symbol number 3 is the backpack. And what it reminds us is just how few things we actually need in life. Matter of fact, my brother-in-law, Pete, halfway through the trip decided that basically the only thing he needed to carry was an extra water bottle along the way. The rest of the stuff he could pick up along the way. Symbol number 3, what's in your backpack? Symbol number 4 are these trekking poles. Now, there was a gentleman by the name of Deacon Willie who had walked the Camino twice before us. And he said these trekking poles are more important than clean underwear along the way, because the terrain is going to be so varied. Sometimes you're going to be walking up these pretty steep hills. Sometimes you're going to be walking down. Sometimes you're going to be walking through fairly wide pathways like this one. Other times it's going to be very narrow and there'll be walls of stone on either side of you. Sometimes you'll be walking on highways. Sometimes you'll be walking on gravel pathways. Sometimes you'll be walking through roots. Sometimes you'll be fording streams. And you need these trekking poles to help you maintain your balance through the trek. Well, these trekking poles became symbols of we need to depend on one another throughout the trek. None of us can walk the pilgrimage of life by ourselves. We need friends, we need family, we need others to help us along the way. People that we can literally lean on to be there for us. Part of what's so wonderful about the Camino is that you're meeting literally people from all over the world who come to walk this pathway in Spain. But as you're walking along, sometimes you can speak their language, sometimes you can't, and you're becoming physically depleted along the way. One of our pilgrims, a gentleman by the name of Kevin, and he gave me permission to be able to tell this story, was walking along and he became so depleted as he was so tired. He's a gentleman in his 70s walking along. He was so tired. He came up to someone and he met a young woman along the way, and she started speaking to him in English, and he turned to her and he said, "I'm sorry, I don't speak English." And then he walked away, continuing on his pilgrim path. And he thought about that later and he said, what did I just say? This woman was speaking English to me and I told her I couldn't speak English. All of us need to depend on one another. Sometimes it's easy to understand what other people are saying. Sometimes it's hard to understand. Sometimes it's easy to ask for help. Sometimes it's hard to ask for help. But these trekking poles become symbols of what we need to lean on to help us, especially when we get tired in the midst of the journey. Now there's one other symbol, and that is the symbol of walking the Camino, and that's this shell. This is the universal symbol throughout Spain of being a pilgrim walking the Camino. It has in the center of it a red cross that is a distinct design that's known as the Cross of St. James. And these shells, nobody knows exactly how that tradition got it started. But the tradition that I like the best is that after pilgrims go to St. James, many of us continue on the way to the ocean, on the edge of Spain, to what's called Finisterre, which literally means Finisterre, the end of the world. So you go and you're looking out on the ocean, and there are these shells, and the pilgrims will pick up the shells as a reminder of the completion of their pilgrimage. Part of what I love about the shell is that the spokes, it's like spokes are radiating out from the shell itself. And that's a reminder that nobody makes a pilgrimage just for your own personal renewal. You want to come back and you want to be a renewed person. You want to take what you've learned, what the Lord has taught you in the course of the pilgrimage, and carry that back to your family, carry that back to your friends, carry that back to those in need. Now, the 34 of us that were making the pilgrimage, we did that with high-tech equipment, like these poles and these special boots that I got, and warm but light clothing and special hats to be able to shield us from the sun. We were well equipped and good backpacks. But as I walked the pilgrimage, I was thinking of the fact that for 1,000 years, pilgrims had been walking these ways. And that right now, people are making pilgrimages who don't have the opportunity that we have to purchase all this high-tech equipment. I was thinking of the refugees who were fleeing their homelands because of violence from drugs or violence in the midst of civil wars. And literally, they're carrying everything they have on their backs. And they didn't have expensive equipment. They were fleeing for their lives. As I walked and continued to look at this shell, I was thinking, I want to stand in solidarity with those refugees and with immigrants around the world who were fleeing from their lives. That became part of the purpose for me in walking the pilgrimage, to lift up those who are in need around the world. 5 symbols of the Camino. As we walk, we have to follow those arrows. We have to look in our life as to where the Lord is pointing us and follow where He directs. We have to recognize that there are going to be times when we're going to be sick and we're going to need help, and we're going to have to ask for some first aid because none of us can do it alone. We're going to have to depend on others. We're going to have to lean on others and to be able to maintain our balance in the midst of the trek. We're going to have to think about what it is that we're carrying and let go of any excess weight. And to recognize that this journey of life is not just about ourselves. It's about how can we reach out and help others in the journey. That was my Camino. Step by step by step, we draw closer to the Lord. Amen? Amen.